Hello and welcome to another painting video. In this video, I'm painting these dog toys. And over here we have the final result. And before it looked like that, it looked like this. How did I get here? I'll show you in this video. But first, if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and like the video. You know what? I can't do this jolly YouTube thing. Let's just paint. Now, before we actually paint, we have to transfer the drawing to this panel. We are working on an oil-primed wooden surface. I'm using charcoal because it's really easy to remove if you make a mistake. And also I'm using a broad grid, and that really helps with the placement of the plush animals. I spent quite some time on a good composition, so I didn't want things to be out of whack. I wanted them to be exactly where they were on the initial drawing. And time for the palette. We have titanium white, cadmium yellow, cadmium red, an oily quinacridone rose, ultramarine blue, burnt umber, yellow ochre, and turquoise blue. And with these colors, I'm just gonna establish a fundamental layer, a base layer, which we can work upon later. By the way, check out that straight line. That is done with the ivory dagger from Rosemary & Co. And that was kind of the point of this whole video. I ordered these new brushes and I just wanted to try them out. Even though there's one little painting I used them on before this one, which was a tiny landscape painting. And over here I'm using a filbert, a number 3, also from the Ivory series. Initially I wanted this painting to be really expressive, but I gravitate towards more tight paintings, so gradually it became tighter and tighter. But at this initial stage, it's still fairly loose, and the colors are close to what the end result will be, although the end result will look a lot better than this. I have to say, apologies for the quick jumps here. I lost quite some footage when I was transferring all the data because I made a mistake. But luckily that only happened at the first stage of this process, which is the block-in, and that's what you're watching now, so it's not that big of a deal. All I want is to establish the tones and of course the drawing, and that's exactly what I've done here. And now it's day 2. And in this day or session, we're gonna focus on one plush animal at a time. So for today, that's the chicken. I'm using a combination of cadmium red, ultramarine blue, and burnt umber to achieve a darker but still quite chromatic red. I don't use any black on my palette, so in order to make a dark value, I just mix burnt umber and ultramarine blue. And it's okay to wipe away something when you make a mistake. Before I continue, I lay in some of the background so that the edges of the chicken will blend into the background, and that will create a soft edge, which is really important because the chicken's in the background and you don't want super sharp edges in the background because that will destroy the illusion of depth. And it's fairly easy to do if the background's still wet and your chicken is still wet. But I often ignore my own advice and paint sharp edges anyway where they don't belong. I'm doing a lot of work with this ivory filbert number 0. And this is one of those cases where your brain knows it's a white chicken, but because it's so far in the background and it's kind of dark, the white won't be white. It's more of a combination of ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and titanium white, with a tiny bit of yellow and turquoise blue probably, especially in the highlights. And here we are at the end of day 2. And now it's time to move on to this donkey or mule or whatever you want to call it. And usually I work from dark to light, but in this case I wanted to lay down that saturated orange in order to reduce the risk of contamination. And just like before, I'm adding in some background so that I can smoothly blend those edges. And once again, I'm using this filbert number 0 from the Ivory series of Rosemary & Co. By the way, they're not sponsoring me. I just want to share as much useless information as I can. At this stage, I'm still flying through this video because it's not the final layer. This is actually the layer before we get to the fun part, which is the refinement. Now that the most important thing is done, the head, I'm switching back to a darker value in another brush, the Ivory Dagger, 1/4 of an inch. And use this rigger brush to get a bit more precision there before switching back to the filbert. And now the pointed round. Now that the donkey is done, we can move on to the bear. And once again, I'm working from dark to light. In the shadows, we have a dark saturated reddish orangey color. And that's the result of the combination of burnt umber, ultramarine blue, cadmium red, and to bring back the chroma a bit, I'm also using quinacridone rose, especially in the darkest areas, namely in the crevices. And I'm really enjoying this ivory dagger. It's really good to quickly block things in, because it's kind of the combination between a pointed round and a flat brush. And you can also create a continuous thin line with it. However, it's not the best brush to blend with, due to the sharp edge of the dagger. So it would have been better to use a short, soft, thick round brush, but I don't have one. And I'm laying in the final details of the face. Now we come to the least interesting part of this painting, which is the bear's body. There's just not much going on. It's like a giant brown blob, and I kind of regret adding it to the composition. And as you can clearly see, I am not feeling it, but I continue to work on the painting nonetheless, even though I think at that time I just wanted to throw it out of the window. But that's the harsh reality of painting. One day you love what you do, next day you hate it, and then it starts all over again. But it's mostly hate though. While this background is still wet, I'm going to take the opportunity to cover this sticky note. And it consists of 3 parts. One is sticking against the wall. Then the other one is slightly coming forward. And then the bottom part is catching a lot of light. There's this big fold in it. I'm using a pointed round to blend those edges into the background. And here I'm also blending the fish's tail into the background, along with some shadows. And that's the end of day 4. Now it's finally time for the main event, the fish. One of the main reasons that I wanted to paint this painting. In fact, it was just this fish, but while I was doing the photography, I noticed that there wasn't much depth in the painting, so that's why I put other plush animals behind them, which are also dog toys, or at least the donkey is and the chicken is, but not the bear. That's just some random animal I put in there. Now, directly above this fish, there is a spotlight, so he's catching the most light in the entire painting, and there's a real separation between dark and light, and is also the most saturated plush animal of this whole painting. So he's catching all the attention, and that's where the viewer's eyes will go when they first see it. At this stage, I'm not concerned with his fur, because actually it's really furry. I'm first going to lay in the foundation and work on top of it later. While I still have some time and energy left, I'm also going to do the foreground now. using this ivory dagger again. And I want to make sure that in front of the fish, just below the shadow, there will be a very bright part. So there will be a very stark contrast, and that will catch attention as well. Now all that's left is the front of this wooden box, which originally had 2 screws in them, but I got rid of them because they were too distracting. And now we are at the end of day 5. Now it's time to bring out the big guns. Titanium white from Old Holland, yellow ochre from Blocks, cadmium orange from Winsor & Newton, alizarin crimson from Winsor & Newton, ultramarine blue from Old Holland, and burnt umber. Now I'm using a sponge to oil in the chicken, and then I just wipe it off with a paper cloth, and this will make it easier to apply the next layer of paint, and it will also bring back all the stark colors, the stark contrasts and the vibrant colors. And I'm painting with the mindset that this will be the final layer, the final pass. I don't want to create a 4th layer anymore. It's really going back and forth and blending everything together. That beak needs to be a bit darker, so I'm using turquoise blue on top of the burnt umber and cadmium yellow, and that will kind of neutralize the color. For most of the refining process, I'm using Da Vinci Nova pointed rounds. In this case, it's a number 6, I think, my trusty number 6, which is kind of busted up right now. I need a new set. Oh, I remember this day. It was super hot in my studio. And I was actually leaning onto the surface, and there was a lot of dead skin and sweat coming off, and it was pretty disgusting. The chicken wing is catching a lot of light from the fish, so that's why you see all that orange there at the bottom. And I'm using more of that dirty yellow to finish the belly. And that's it for this session. Alright, now it's time to refine the donkey, but first we need to apply a little bit of oil. And I'm taking my time, checking with the reference. Is the stroke in the right direction? What's happening with the hair? Etc. At this time I noticed that the value of the foreground is too close to the value of the bottom of the mouth, so I need to fix that later so that there's a clear distinction between the donkey and the background. I'm gradually painting the light on his snout, but I don't overdo it because, it's not a light bulb, but it's clearly brighter than the white chicken in the background. I'm really careful here with the smile. This is a selling point. And now I'm just reworking this transfer, this transition, and I'm also adding the light. And this is a 3D form, so there's a seam in the middle of his face. That's why you have this curve going down, and the color transitions to this darkish purplish tone. And it gets serious when I take off my glasses. I'm really zoning in on all these little details. Oh, and that's the end of the day. As you may have noticed, this is a very systematic, methodical approach. The initial idea of being expressive and painterly has gone completely out of the window. I'm always going chicken, donkey, bear, fish. And once I painted those seams with the pointed round, he really started coming to life. And of course, in the areas where there's less definition required, I switched to a bigger pointed round, which is the number 10, I think. And of course the bear is brown, but where the light hits, we're gonna shift the color more to yellow, and in this case a muted yellow. He's in the background, so we don't want any super highly chromatic yellow there, because that's gonna catch a lot of attention. Just for convenience, I got rid of the eyes so that I could focus on the whole area, and then later I would just use a ear thing to get rid of the paint and just paint them back in. Of course, if you want a realistic looking bear, it's not enough to just paint in those shapes. There's an indent where these eyes and the nose are, so that creates a curve, and that creates, of course, a shadow. So I've softened these edges with a darker value. And as icing on the cake, we paint this specular highlight in his eye, which you also don't need to paint super brightly because that would also break the realism. And you see I'm significantly now cooling down the bear because he was too warm, was just too orangey. Then for the highlights in his fur, I'm using a even more muted version of this color. And I increase the brightness just a little bit. And by more muted, I mean it's going more gray, so the chroma drops more and more. And I remember here I was getting really disinterested in the painting. I got really sloppy. And that concludes day 8. Before we move on to the main event, we need to do this sticky note. And I'm just refining the edge here. But I'm also increasing the realism by adding little cracks and subtle shifts in the terrain, so to speak, of the note. And because this note is not on the original reference, I now have to imagine a cast shadow. This could probably confuse the viewer a bit, so because these edges are quite sharp, so the viewer can ask himself, is this note on the surface, or is this note in the background of this painting? You know what I mean? Now, I painted the sticky note first because I need to paint a drawing of a dog paw on top, and I don't want to do that in one session because that would make things too messy. I'm just gonna paint the dog paw on top of the notes the next time I paint. And here I'm really defining the teeth so that they read better, because in the reference photo it's unclear what's going on there. This tubular form of the upper lip is catching a lot of reflective light from the surface, so that cancels out the shadow you would expect to be there. Although granted, there could have been a bit more coarse shadow, I think. Sorry for the jump here in footage. It was the one time I forgot to actually turn on the camera and record. But all I'm doing now is just using the rigger brush and the pointed round to add tiny little marks that are brighter in value than the layer below. And especially near the Terminator there, that creates a lot of contrast. And it makes the fish come alive before my eyes. Once I'm done with those brighter marks, I'm going back in there with some darker values and carve out some more shapes. In here I totally messed up. This is the focal point really of the whole painting. And yeah, I got super careless and I wiped everything off and just moved on to the fin here, which is the highest chroma yellow you'll find on this entire painting. And to finish the fish off, I'm adding more details to the tail, but it's not catching a lot of light, so it doesn't become as bright as the foreground, which creates another layer of depth. Now I'm drawing the dog paw on top of the sticky note with a piece of charcoal. And then I'm just gonna go over it with my trusty number 6. At first it said dog toys, but I changed that to this dog paw because, well, it's a symbol and everybody in the world would recognize it. As I'm approaching the end of this painting, I'm adding a semi-transparent glaze on top of the background and foreground. I'm not touching the animals themselves, I'm touching the edges of the animals, but I'm not going over the animals themselves. Remember that I talked about the mouth of the donkey being a bit too close in value to the background? Well, I fixed that here. So now there's a more clear separation between his snout and the background or foreground, whatever you want to call it. And here I'm using the palette knife to create some texture. But some of these lines, especially on the sides, are way too sharp, so later on I will blend them out and really focus most of the detail close to where the fish is. In the reference photo, there's not much going on in terms of texture of the wood, so I'm sort of just imagining how it would look like if this were, you know, some nice wood like oak or something. So here I'm blending them out with a bristle brush, hog hair, and I'm adding the final details with the pointed round. I've now waited for 2 weeks and it's time to add a coat of Retouch varnish, and I'm filling the container because it was a bit empty almost and I don't want it to run out while I am varnishing. I'm working from left to right in one direction, but I immediately noticed that some areas repel the varnish, and in areas where that occurs I just change the direction of the strokes and sort of put a bit more pressure on it and just rub it in. And when all those holes are filled up, I go over the entire painting again from left to right. And that's how I painted this painting. I hope this video was insightful, helpful, or useful to you. If it was, please hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and let's get this channel to 1,000 subs. I have no idea what to paint next, so if you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!